Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about the aftermath of the Louisiana Purchase and some interesting goings on that take place centered around first Aaron Burr, Vice President of the United States, and later on Americans and others who were interested in detaching parts of what they thought was the original purchase, an area that we'll call West Florida, and making that part of the United States in the years after 1803 and 1804. Jefferson is very eager in the aftermath of the purchase to take advantage of what we might call hazy boundaries of the Louisiana Territory and get disputed sections from the Spanish. At some point, he thought Florida was part of the purchase, and he also thought even areas beyond the Sabine River, the divide between Louisiana and Spanish Texas, might be part of the territory. He, in fact, argues that the western boundary goes to the Rio Grande. And this is something, not surprisingly, that the Spanish wholeheartedly deny. But his men in France, the individuals who had hoped to negotiate the treaty with that government in obtaining Louisiana, argue that the Perdido River made up the boundary. That was the old French border. It would give the United States territory in what is now West Florida, the peninsula, to be specific. And if he could get that, that would be fantastic. But certainly to increase the amount of area along the panhandle as well. The French minister, when the American asked about where the territory starts and stops, essentially give an answer that say, I can give you no direction on the matter. The American reaction is quite simple. They claim West Florida and they offer to buy the lands from Spain. And just as Jefferson thought, well, as long as Louisiana is Spanish, eventually it will fall into our hands. When it became French, he then made more efforts to buy it. He thought it was a pretty good deal for the Spanish. Why won't they take money we offer before we actually go and just outright take it? With Americans moving to the area and then Spain's hold of the region actually becoming more and more weak. So short of that, he and Congress are able to extend the amount of territory, extend the American hold of the region. So again, bring in, integrate more of this disputed territory, and that would strengthen the American position in territory that Jefferson already thinks belongs to the United States, if not officially, hopefully by passing some legislation, such as in 1804, what's called the Mobile Act. It extends the U.S. revenue laws, trade laws, directly into West Florida. And then Jefferson does something that isn't exactly his strong suit. He rattles sabers and makes, again, not outright threats, but at least his intention and the nation's intention now to Spain, that we're going to bring in this territory sooner or later, which is strange because the United States in 1804 and 1805 really does not have a strong military presence. In fact, Jefferson's been doing everything to cut the size of the Army and Navy after he took office in 1801. Well, there are already people involved in making the West an area for their adventures, for their advancement, for even military glory. One of them was, of course, Aaron Burr, who at the end of Jefferson's first term was basically told that he wouldn't stay on as a second term as vice president. And that had a lot to do with the results of the 1800 election that ended in a tie between Jefferson and Burr. There was a lot of ill feelings between the two men. But the party, Jefferson's party, essentially tells Burr that you may want to find another career. So Burr runs for office, and the one that he was after is governor of New York, and he lost. And he blamed his fellow veteran of the American Revolution, Alexander Hamilton, for that loss. And in a series of letters where Burr accuses Hamilton of expressing these not so kind opinions about him, and Hamilton doesn't provide a good answer as far as Burr is concerned, the two meet across the river from New York and New Jersey and conduct a duel where Burr shoots Hamilton, and the day after, Hamilton dies. So here we have the sitting vice president, because his term technically isn't over, and who has warrants out for his arrest. So time, Burr thinks, maybe for a new start. He's already thinking of a plan to head west at the end of his vice presidential term. And he reestablishes, here's a picture of Burr as a younger man, reestablishes connections with someone in the West that he had known back in the days of the American Revolution when they were both soldiers. This man is James Wilkinson, who is one of the most nefarious characters ever in American history. He's the territorial governor of Louisiana. And what I said earlier is that the territory of the purchase was divided into two sections. Much of what we now consider modern Louisiana was called the Territory of Orleans, governed by William Claiborne. Wilkinson had everything north, which was a vast territory of Americans, French, Native Americans. Again, to give this guy the job was possibly the worst pick ever. At the time, Wilkinson was appointed the territorial governor of what we might call Upper Louisiana. He was also Agent 13, being paid directly by the Spanish government. So he's working for two masters in 1804 and afterwards. This man is a notorious scoundrel. Let's not pull any punches. He's given this very important job for the United States government. He took an oath to the army, and now he's working for the Spanish, feeding them information about, among other things, American military matters, and maybe as important, the mindset of Americans who live in the West. Do they, Americans in the West, have a lot of allegiance to the United States, or would they be interested in possibly allying themselves with the Spanish? It's a common story in the West, whether we talk about the development of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, Kentucky, or the American Southwest. By that I mean Alabama and Louisiana. This idea that with people moving ahead of the powers of government and the lack of government, lack of incorporating these settlers in the West into the United States, that leads to a lot of frustration and a lot of impatience among Westerners. So in 1804 and 1805, Burr and Wilkinson begin to meet and look over the Florida and Texas maps to try to come up with some idea. Could they, Wilkinson asked, court or make some inroads and connections to officers in the West in the U.S. Army who are disgruntled with Jefferson's policy? Would they engage in any kind of plot? Would they become involved? What the plot was, they weren't exactly sure. Wilkinson seems to think that these military officers are very disgruntled and could be recruited to his plan. And again, he has reason to believe this. One Kentucky speculator comments, quote, "Mexico glitters in our eyes. The word is all we wait for," unquote, meaning that there might be a future in more territorial acquisition in the West. If not an allegiance with Spain, maybe just seizing more territory beyond the Louisiana Purchase into Spanish Texas and modern-day Mexico itself. Burr also attempts to get the British and get aid from them, financial aid, and maybe even naval aid from them. Now, there already is concern in the Northwest Territory about British movement to inciting Native Americans to supply them with weapons to, of course, help stunt the growth of the United States. And now Burr, former Vice President Burr, is meeting with the former European colonial nation that controlled the American colonies before 1776. So this is an interesting scheme, and even to this day, 200 years later, we're not entirely sure what Burr and Wilkinson had in mind, but we are able to keep up with their travels during this time. Burr's travels in the West, and he goes on to move all around the place. In Ohio, the Mississippi River, he confers with individuals in the West, some of whom might be sympathetic to some of these ideas. Some of them who are folks like Andrew Jackson, who might be involved or at least give an idea to this plan in 1804 and in 1805. He touches base with Jackson, who is a Tennessee militia officer. It had always been Jackson's hope that they could acquire in the West more territory from Spain, but Jefferson might be moving too slowly. So they're rattling the sabers in the West. Whether or not Jefferson will follow up on this and his hesitation, again, frustrates a lot of people. War with Spain never breaks out, largely because the two nations agree to demilitarize parts of the West, the neutral ground, which is effectively from Natchitoches, Louisiana, until the Sabine River, and basically to not move soldiers there from a period of the aftermath of the Louisiana Purchase up until Louisiana is made a state, and then the borders are more firmly established. What may have really eliminated the possibility of an ongoing war with Spain were actions of Governor Claiborne. And Governor Claiborne was working out in the West and actually traveling to areas near Natchitoches. And he was working with, of all people, John Sibley, someone those of us in Natchitoches are probably familiar with. And in 1806, working with their Spanish representatives, Claiborne and Sibley, essentially write this neutral ground agreement, saying that they will not station soldiers during the period after the Louisiana Purchase. There was always a threat of a military conflict as soldiers in Natchitoches near the fort moved sometimes into what they thought was Spanish territory, and Spanish soldiers out of Texas moved across the Sabine River. But the potential for war was really diminished when we had this neutral ground agreement signed in 1806. And what really is confusing of what we might call the Burr conspiracy is that Burr told so many people so many different things. His ultimate goal may never be clear in a lot of his correspondence, his letters that may have been revealing as to what he had in mind. Was he going to march with an army down the Mississippi, get people in this small force, and march into Mexico and either bring it into the United States, or would he just make himself dictator of American Mexico? We're not even sure at this point what he had in mind. But he's certainly on the move and got a lot of people's attention. In the summer of 1806, he leads 60 or so men on flatboats down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. We don't really know his real plan. Did he mean to filibuster, which means organize a military expedition, get support among Westerners? Did he plan on attacking West Florida, a region that was not yet part of the United States? Plan on expanding the Louisiana border into Spanish Texas? crown himself emperor. Who knows? All of that is up in the air. But he will later, after news reaches President Jefferson about Aaron Burr and what he was doing in the West, it gets the attention of the president, who begins to hear things about people. Burr's out here, he's doing this. Jefferson starts gathering information. Soldiers like Jackson say that, well, Burr's idea of maybe expanding the United States, it's a great idea. I'm all for it. To which Jefferson and his cabinet say, we're not talking about doing this militarily. And why is Aaron Burr going around talking to people, acting as if he's speaking for the United States government? Burr is actually arrested in 1806 and brought before a grand jury in Kentucky for his role in his Western travels, but there just is not enough evidence to proceed. And as the case for Burr, even though the grand jury failed to indict him, Jefferson continues to get information, and it makes Wilkinson, this co-conspirator in this plan, a little bit nervous. And Wilkinson, decides, well, it's time to cover my behind and sell out my co-conspirator Aaron Burr. So he sends a letter to Jefferson warning of, quote, a deep, dark, and widespread conspiracy, unquote. And that seems to be a turning point where Jefferson orders the arrest of Aaron Burr when he's found. Burr, after being arrested, is paroled, meaning he's under arrest, he's going to be moved east for trial, and he's given the right to effectively go out on his own, but he has to, of course, report to this grand jury that will take place. Shockingly, he tries to escape, and he's eventually caught and brought in front of the circuit court in Richmond, Virginia, and placed on trial for treason, a treason trial that he eventually survives and is found not guilty. Nevertheless, it represents part of the story of the West as not together always a secure place. It also is an area that Jefferson takes quite a bit of interest in, although, as we know from our readings in the textbook and in Stephen Ambrose's book, a man who is supposed to be so in favor of Western settlement doesn't travel on his own a lot to the West. So Jefferson is one of those individuals who is very interested in the geography, in getting every scrap of information about not only the physical characteristics of the West, but also those who live there. Jefferson is interested in the ethnography, and maybe knows that better than anyone else. It's something he had written about. People of Virginia, both white and black. His notes on the state of Virginia reflect his interests. No other American president was probably as interested in the indigenous people as Thomas Jefferson, and that was one of the missions he charged Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery. Jefferson, during his earlier life in his political career and even in its aftermath, collects different scraps of information about Native Americans, about their physical appearance, about their orations and spoken language, their habits, their vocabulary. And Jefferson, in some ways, as president, represents his people of his age in trying to have a high interest in Native Americans. We saw some of that with Washington and Knox trying to work out a coherent Indian policy in the 1790 Treaty of New York. He's not alone. The revolutionary generation was interested in the idea that some notes, some information should be gathered before the Indians as a people are gone, that effectively they've been destroyed over the generations since the early colonies. And there's what we might call a fixation among whites for Indians being central to the hopes and dreams of the American Republic. And it represents in some ways this idea, should they be integrated into white society? Should settlement patterns go around and leave what Washington and Knox called homelands for them? Or should, by the end of this time of Jefferson and beyond, a third option, the idea of outright removal, that whites and Indians cannot live together? Part of the interest in Native American life and their history had to do with what Europe was saying about America. Western scientific minds were beginning to conclude in the late 1700s and early 1800s that the New World climate, the North American climate, was not good to life in general. There was something off about everything, the weather patterns, the extremes of hot and cold, and that might have led to the creation of indigenous people, again, not fully understanding where Indians migrated from, where they came to the Americas. So in some ways, Jefferson is reacting to what Europeans, and Europe was the leader in science because the Americans were kind of provincials and still in this developmental stage. And in some ways, that very much influenced folks like the Comte de Buffon of France. He's not what we think about him now, his opinions about the American whether indigenous people and transplanted Europeans. Doesn't make him a crackpot. We might conclude it by our own modern sensibilities about what he said, but Buffon wrote a 36-volume natural history of the world and concluded in a rather pessimistic tone about America as a region quite different from the rest of the world, and specifically Europe. He says, quote, "Some combination of elements and other physical causes, something that opposes the amplification of animated nature," unquote. Meaning that something was different there, and maybe it was influencing the development of the people there. It was a new continent, he said. It was more human. It had more varied weather patterns. In short, America was an unhealthy place to live. The animals were underdeveloped. There are some animals that did not live on the continent of North America, such as lions. All of the animals on the continent, Comte de Buffon claims, are, quote, 4, 6, and 8 times smaller, unquote, than those in the older continents. This, of course, when it was read by leading Americans like Jefferson, infuriated him. He worked tirelessly in the 1780s to refute Buffon's claims, making, among other things, efforts to ship skeletons of different American animals into and over to Paris when he was minister to Paris, Jefferson, in the 1780s. There's a great scene in the movie Jefferson in Paris where you see this reconstructed skeleton of, I believe it was an American elk that was carried in to refute the claims that were being accepted by this Frenchman during the time period. Amidst all this discussion and debate, it gets back to Native Americans. Had Jefferson even wondered? So he dismisses some of the claims of the leading so-called European scientists, but he wonders at the back of his mind if there may be some truth to it. Had climate with the American Indian made a difference? And he decides, well, it might not be a difference of nature, but a difference of circumstance. Why did Native Americans or Indians not live the same way as Europeans, either by the time of colonization in the 14 and 1500s, and then later on in Jefferson's time when he's reconsidering these ideas? And it is Jefferson who concludes, quote, "The Indian in body and mind is the equal of the white man." unquote. And rather interesting conclusion. Jefferson is selective about his opinions on race. He will not assign the same equality for blacks in the United States. In fact, he writes in detail about African Americans in his notes on the state of Virginia and says that they are just radically different in many ways than whites, and argues that that might make it permanently a case where whites will not accept African Americans in the United States. He cannot admit, in this case, the inferiority of the red man, but he will for Africans. Maybe it's because Jefferson argues that Indians are the product and soil of the climate of America. So his racial views are, well, to our ears, shocking, of course, but if you get past that part, you have to understand what his point of view might be between different races in the United States. Jefferson had to admit that the Indian might be simply at an early stage of development, the hunting and gathering part of life. There's no lack, Jefferson argues, in native genius, maybe just a lack of cultivation. This has to be his argument. Because if it's not, environmental conditions that the Europeans are arguing about are true. That the environment of the continent of North America has been keeping Native Americans from advancing. Well, he says that's not really the case. And if it is the case, if Europeans are right, maybe Americans might go back to the hunting and gathering stages of civilization and development. Now, these are, again, words and standards that, again, make us kind of cringe when you think about it, and rightfully so. Whose measure of civilization? Jefferson, as we know, would look at some of the ultimate forms of so-called civilization, cities and technology, and be as frightened and unsettled by them as anything else he saw in his life. But there is an argument among those in the United States that the idea of regressing, of the idea that those in the West might become more like Native Americans in their lifestyle, in their language, in what they did to survive. It often is attached to Westerners on the frontier, this kind of almost a savage mentality that folks would have said in Jefferson's time. Jefferson celebrates the frontier, but whites were often moving into the West, and they said, and they used the term, white savages. Those settlers who bashed Indian children, severed limbs of the dead, and engaged in warfare that some thought, well, this would only happen among Native American cultures. And at the same time, there was this fear in American literature in the early 19th century. There was more and more of a fascination with these stories, or what very much was sold as popular literature, the idea of Americans abandoning civilization, getting back to nature in the early years after the Constitution. Americans are fascinated with the idea. It's kind of a romanticized, heightened importance. So there is at one level this idea that, oh, what if the continent can influence how people live, and that had affected the tens of millions of Indians who lived on the continent before Europeans came over. But at the same time, we're seeing books and the infancy of American literature, like, what's the example? The leather stocking tales. Now that would be, of course, Last of the Mohicans and the books of James Fenimore Cooper. Was America advancing from rudeness to refinement? Or was the West reversing the process? Well, that hardly seems the case, because we know in the West, cities which were at some point just small towns and trading posts and forts, are developing very quickly in the American West. And that, for a lot of people, is the ultimate symbol of modernity and advancement or civilization, such as they would call it. By moving into the West, some argued in the nation, Easterners who were cultivated and citified were losing their politeness and refinement. It was scary to some. Jefferson said the tendency of the American character is then to degenerate, and to degenerate rapidly, and that not from any peculiar vice in the American people, but from the very nature of a spreading population. The population of the country is outgrowing its institutions. Wow, and that quote really represents some of the genuine fear that the Federalist Party had in the West. They were going to lose control politically, that the institutions of organization and government couldn't keep up with the fast pace at which people were moving along in the early 1800s. Nervous questions about the Indians and Americans persisted. If the Indian could not be, according to Jefferson and other whites, quote unquote, civilized, what was it going to mean for white farmers moving out to the West, and maybe they would become more like Native Americans? Jefferson thinks the real goal of an Indian policy is to introduce lifestyles like whites. It happens in his first annual message, or we would call it today the State of the Union. Again, this is the first time he addresses Congress. Introduce animal husbandry to Indians. No one, of course, at the time thought, do Indians want to live this way? Their lifestyle is different depending on what part of the country you're talking about. More hunting and gathering, more movement of semi-permanent villages, dealing with the seasons of the year, communication. Living the way they do is not an alternative lifestyle. It's their way of life. So again, whose definition of so-called civilization are you going to accept? So Jefferson mentions this idea, continuing some type of Indian policy. His intentions are good. Unfortunately, he probably never considered, and this is most often the problem with American leaders. Indians maybe like the way they live and want to be left alone, don't want to lose more of their land. And Jefferson promises, quote, in time, you will be as we are. You will become one people with us. Your blood will mix with ours and will spread with ours over this great land, unquote. So he's effectively saying, let the population equation or numbers run their course. White Americans will surround Indian hunting grounds, limiting them, Native Americans, to small plots of land to farm. So they will have to be forced into that situation to adopt the ideas of becoming like the small farmer that Jefferson idealized and said will be the key to the West. He's arguing that that will be the future and will have to be the future for Native Americans. The remainder of their land that is, again, open for their own hunting grounds, their ancestral land will then be given to the United States in a series of treaties, and he is very anxious to begin this treaty signing process. The one Indian nation that we see kind of going about things differently as far as adopting some ideas, and this is interesting because in Native American cultures there are different schools of thought. The idea to integrate with whites, adopt their lifestyle, which will mean their survival, or which we might call accommodation, or resistance. At the same time that we're beginning to see among the Cherokee Indians, this idea of accommodation. We see in the Northwest a movement to unify Indian nations and to reject the clothing, guns, alcohol, and land swindling by whites. This will be the revival movement done by Tenskwatawa and the prophet and his brother Tecumseh in the early 1800s, leading to the War of 1812. Well, if assimilation and acculturation is the goal, one Indian group, the Cherokee, which at one point lived in areas of western Virginia, Georgia, North and South Carolina, had lost land during and after the American Revolution. They are a group living not only among whites, but most like whites, living in houses, which would be based on American and European styles, farming, owning slaves, developing a written language, and also accepting in constitutional form their own government and their own legal customs. Jefferson's idea of acculturation, his plan by the end of his term in office, proves to be an outright disaster. The idea that, well, maybe we can make all Indians farm like us, that will confine them to smaller areas of land. They will then give that land to the American government. That, again, it represents in some ways another failed story of the American government to deal with the Native American question. And he knows it. He knows that Indian society and culture tend to disintegrate when it comes in contact with whites, alcohol, trade, and a reliance on European and American trade goods is what he thinks might weaken Native American cultures. And if that makes them turn land over, that might be the answer as far as he's concerned. Disease is something that took an incredible toll as well. In 1802, the smallpox epidemic killed 3/4 of Native Americans living along the juncture of the Mississippi and the Missouri River, obviously brought by Americans, Europeans in the area. This is right before the Lewis and Clark expedition that happens a couple of years later. It means for many people after the first several administrations or presidencies have tried to adopt different Indian policies, all which were kind of a disaster and didn't go very well. It begins to initiate, we might say, talk of stopping assimilation, and that overlooks what's happening in the Cherokee nations in the early 1800s. They're, as far as they're concerned, playing by all of the rules that they were told to do with this assimilation idea. Some have argued, in spite of that success, and maybe because of that success, the best thing to do would be to encourage a policy of removal, to literally put in place and save the Native Americans from extinction by total separation with the whites. The way would be prepared with this mindset in the early 1800s of the wholesale removal of the Eastern Native Americans by Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. And by that time, he is going to argue at the idea of this being the only humane thing to do. He's criticized Jackson for his Indian policy, but he would respond to anyone who was talking about it that this is the only way really to save Native Americans. Talk continued, even though more and more people were beginning to think of the idea of removal and separation as the only solution. There's still continue this incorporation or assimilation ideas. And it's taking on this tone of, well, it was a lost opportunity. People who were east of the Mississippi there were fewer and fewer Indians. And folks in the established areas of the country kind of look back almost with nostalgia and say, well, it's a shame what happened. Indians represent human dignity and freedom, which are values that would become associated with the West. These two subjects are inextricably bound together in the rest of the 19th century or the 1800s. So it plagues American presidents. It plagues the nation in its early years. And also, we have a problem with the American West concerning specifically areas that had not been acknowledged as part of the United States. And this is a way to kind of awkwardly shift gears and talk a little bit about the story of West Florida. And this first incorporation challenge for the United States, how do you bring in to the territory of Louisiana both the Orleans section, which is present-day Louisiana, and the upper Louisiana area? How do you bring that together, considering a lot of the population is not American? The U.S. government tries to control the movement of foreign-born slaves in the area. There's an outright fear of rebellion. In the early 1800s, there was also a significant increase in the number of free people of color in the Orleans territory, especially around the city of New Orleans. Just to give you an idea, in 1810, there are 7,500 people, black and white, in the Orleans territory, and 6,000 in the city specifically on the Mississippi, New Orleans itself. So 7,500 in the whole territory, 6,000 in the city. Again, 20% of the population, free people of color. And it throws Americans for a loop because the French and Spanish idea of race and either winning, purchasing your freedom, the ability of slave owners to free the people that they own, again, a lot different, in some ways easier to achieve than in the American model, where there's a very strict white and black divide in parts of, again, the North and especially in the South. Free people of color are given rights such as marriage, property ownership, and for a Virginian like Jefferson and his governor, his appointee, William Claiborne, who's based in New Orleans, this is something they're not quite prepared to deal with. One area that is also particularly contentious is West Florida. By West Florida, we mean effectively everything from the Perdido River, just west of Pensacola, all the way over, which would include Mobile and even sections of what is now made up of the southeastern parishes of Louisiana. It includes parts of Mississippi and Alabama. So when we hear West Florida, we're not only thinking about Florida proper as we know it, the western extent of the Panhandle, but other territories as well. This is the region I started with in the beginning, arguing that Jefferson, in his best case scenario, thought East Florida, the peninsula itself, was certainly going to be part of the purchase. If that was not the case, then certainly West Florida should be. That's access to the Gulf, and will be very important for the development of those territories after 1803 and 1804. Spain, however, refuses to relinquish the area. Even in the western areas of the Louisiana Purchase, what I mentioned before, there seems to be an effort to remove the chance of war with the Neutral Ground Agreement in 1806. Spanish officials refuse to resolve any conflicting land claims, especially in West Florida. You have Europeans, you have Spanish, American residents there, and they are all having rival claims to land in the area. So more settlers moving in, certainly more folks moving with white and black alike into western Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. This region is going to be critically important for trade and the future access to the Atlantic. So that's what's at stake after 1804. The period just before 1810, a large number of Americans move into the area, and they claim in West Florida that there is a lack of authority. The Spanish hold beyond New Orleans, again, hadn't been very strong with setting up a kind of an infrastructure such as courts. So the Americans move in. They're joined by a smattering of French and British loyalists. The British who moved to Florida for a brief time when that province was controlled by the English, and now they're moving out of Florida in the early 1800s. The Americans are a combination of, in some cases, army deserters and those looking for a safe haven. They're criminals moving from other parts of the Upper South. Some cases they're soldiers that have gone absent without leave, and people who want to simply claim land without a lot of legal authority to it. Claiborne notices this. The territorial governor of Orleans, reporting to President Jefferson and later on President Madison in the aftermath, notes the trouble. He says, quote, "Civilian authority remains weak and lax in West Florida, particularly in eastern regions where the influence of the laws is scarcely felt," unquote. And American filibusters, meaning folks who want to start a possible military expedition to seize the territory, have revolutionary ideas about what to do with the region. So by the time of the purchase in 1803 and 1804, the Spanish inability to control the area and to resolve the conflict is beginning to affect not only Spanish and French and British, but American residents there. There's a seditious mix of elements in West Florida. It's volatile. It's violent. There's been whole books written about the Florida parishes, even after it was integrated into parts of the United States up through and after the American Civil War. Remember hearing about what we know as the classic family conflict after the Civil War, be the Hatfields and the McCoys, where people were killed on both sides and it went on for generations. That is nothing. That's child's play as far as the number of those who were killed compared to what happened in the West Florida parishes, especially of Louisiana. Even after statehood, even after Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana statehood, this region becomes a very violent area. Blood feuds going back before the American Civil War and in the years of Reconstruction. So, and it just, the numbers are staggering when compared to other, again, overly violent areas of the United States, parts like South Carolina and during Reconstruction times. So that goes back. There's a history to that, and it goes back to where both Spain and the United States claim the area, but the U.S. is moving by extending trade laws beyond New Orleans and Baton Rouge to Mobile. In that act of Congress in 1804 and 1805, that's going to be the first step in trying to bring in the other territory. In other words, to prove to Spain that your ability to hold on to that is an inability, really, is going to create a situation where we will take it. Best case scenario is that you sell it to us, but the Spanish aren't ready to do that. Not surprisingly, if the U.S. moves to seize West Florida, the Spanish can see the writing on the wall. They're just going to move to the west and seize Texas, and also wouldn't even stop at the Rio Grande, maybe moving into what is now Mexico itself. So there's a reason why the Spanish would hold on to that region. Three distinct parties lived in West Florida at the time of the purchase. An American party who want annexation by the United States. There's a second group. They're called independents. They fear annexation, and they think staying with the Spanish government might be the best. And third are loyalists who had moved in from Spanish and British Florida in the years between 1783 and 1803. Would their land claims be recognized by the American government? So three very different forces within these regions of West Florida. And specifically, I know this isn't the best map here, but this is the section of West Florida that would include, here's Baton Rouge, and some of what we will now call the Florida parishes, Felicianas. And this is part of what is today, of course, Louisiana, and a lot of what takes place. The Republic of West Florida is born in this area because Spanish authority at its strongest is in, among other places, Baton Rouge, which is considered one of the Florida parishes, again, there on the eastern side of the Mississippi River. Well, the story about West Florida involves three brothers, Reuben, Samuel, and Nathan Kemper. They were actually kicked out of the Bayou Sara region in the Felicianas because of numerous lawsuits and their claims to land that were not acknowledged by the Spanish. When the Spanish stand by the court orders to, as far as the Kemper brothers are concerned, take their land, they vow revenge. And they would become, again, concerned with independence at the very least, or maybe annexation by the American government. In the summer of 1804, the Kempers and their followers marched to the Spanish fort at Baton Rouge, but they are too weak to seize and capture that Spanish position. But it shows already, just literally months after the United States takes control of the Louisiana Purchase in a ceremony in New Orleans, what's happening in these other far-flung areas. The Kemper brothers moved into the Mississippi Territory, but feared what would happen to other Americans if this instability and, they would argue, lack of infrastructure for law were to continue. By 1810, there was a new governor in the territory, and the American Party demanded a new course. From a council in Feliciana, again, that parish along the Mississippi River below the territory of Mississippi. That's where a lot of the planning of West Florida, the rebellion, will take place. They formed themselves into a council to, quote, secure themselves against foreign invasion and domestic disturbance. Districts in West Florida then send representatives to this council. So the infancy of this kind of government, we might call it a rebellion, is taking place when the continued Spanish inaction emboldens the weakness of the Spanish government, is what's driving this movement to either become independent and wait to see what the United States does, or just bring about outright annexation by the American government. Maybe at first annexation by the territory of Orleans, and then later on statehood. The governor of the Spanish territory out of Baton Rouge, Governor de Lassus, pretends to sympathize with this group and their demands of bringing some order to the area, but he also, behind the scenes, calls from other areas of Spanish territory for reinforcements. He recognizes the real threat the Kemper brothers and others represent. He also sends word to the Spanish governor of Pensacola, in what is now, again, western Florida, for help, meaning soldiers and supplies. Unfortunately for Governor de Lassus, the Spaniard in Baton Rouge, this message of help going to Pensacola is intercepted by Americans. If it's intercepted by Americans, they realize that the Spanish hold in Baton Rouge may be fairly weak. So in 1810, about 70 men form up and march south to Baton Rouge and find an opening at the back, an unguarded opening at the back of the fort, which they are able to storm, march into, and raise the flag, the Lone Star flag, and create what they will christen the Republic of West Florida. And you can see here on this map the territory of West Florida. This would include areas of what are now, of course, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, almost towards Pensacola near the Perdido River. So the Lone Star Republic is an independent territory, nation? I'm not sure. They're organized out of what's now St. Francisville in the Felicianas, north here of Baton Rouge. And it lasts for 74 days. Loyalist forces, loyalists to the Spanish government, try to assemble and recapture the fort, turn the territory back over to Spain, but they are driven far off towards the Pearl River, which is the modern boundary between Louisiana and Mississippi. And the West Florida founders create their own government. They elect a man named Fulwar Skipwith as the president, and with that executive branch, they also create a legislature and a judicial branch. Seeing what's taking place in 1810, it is President Madison who comes in 1809 after Jefferson retires, hears of the events, and orders Territory Governor Claiborne out of New Orleans to annex the area, effectively add the West Florida Territory to Orleans. Only 20% of the people are American in the entire Orleans Territory. But the problem, as far as Madison can see, is that, well, maybe if we add the Americans who live in West Florida, that will bring about a faster transition from Orleans, the lower part of the Louisiana Purchase, into statehood. And not long after that, the time seems right to write a constitution for the territory and later to have it be adopted as a state constitution. An alliance of Creoles and Anglos in the Orleans Territory write a constitution and copy the Kentucky Constitution as their own model. Congress will approve of the Louisiana Constitution in 1812, April of 1812. As you probably are familiar, just a couple years ago, we had the bicentennial for Louisiana statehood. Claiborne is flattered to learn that in spite of his kind of outsider status, he is being retained as the first governor of the state of Louisiana. And a very, very conservative regime was put in place that passed voting laws disqualifying about 2/3 of the white male population. Again, not really reflecting accurately the makeup of the population in the region, which were not Americans. So it's, some would say, given broad powers to the governor, not a lot of power to the people, but that would change, and that's a reflection maybe of the distrust among Americans who were in power there to the Creoles, French, and Spanish, who were also predominant in the creation of Louisiana as a state. But Madison has other issues on his mind. He can't really deal with the niceties of the Louisiana Constitution. 6 weeks after statehood is approved by the United States Congress, that happens April of 1812, Congress again will have an even more important vote. A divided Congress will declare war on Great Britain. The War of 1812 begins during the early summer of that year. And that, of course, occupies a good deal of Madison's time. So this is a story, Jefferson's West, that we started before. Now we're kind of wrapping up. And certainly, with the borders not being very well established, we can see why this might instigate some problems. And I just wanted to go into some detail about a few of them. The movement of people out to the west, Aaron Burr, the West Florida, and what they would call kind of the integration of the Louisiana population, and how that was a very different experience from other expanding western frontiers, whether it be the Northwest or the Southwest, mostly American, and now how Louisiana was rather unique.